Zion and
Oliver here.
we're talking about
The American Revolution.
the British established 13 colonies in North America. There were three main sections of the colonies. The uppermost section was called New England, composed of Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. The middle colonies were composed of Delaware, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and the southern colonies were composed of Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, North and South Carolina. They all had different currencies, governments, and sets of laws. The French and Indian War was fought between the British and colonists against the French and the Indians.
The Virginians wanted the French kicked out of the Ohio country and sent out Washington's troops to give them the message. It failed.
Although most Indians sided with the French, some sided with the British, promised that if the British won the war, they would get to keep most of their land.
Eventually, after 9 years of hard-fought battles, they signed the Treaty of 1763, giving the British much of France's land in North America. King George III needed to pay off the French and Indian war debts, so he imposed the Sugar Act and Stamp Act, which imposed taxes on sugar and stamps. The colonists were unhappy that they were being taxed without represented in the British Parliament, hence the expression, no taxation without representation.
One night in Boston, a drunken mob tried to attack British soldiers with words and anything they could find. With no other way to defend themselves, the soldiers shot at the crowd, killing Crispus Attucks first and 4 others. In court, John Adams, a New Englander, defended them and successfully pardoned all but 2, who got minor sentences. Paul Revere called it the Bloody Massacre, grossly over-exaggerating it, firing up the nation.
The Tea Act of 1773 was also another tax imposed by King George III on tea. In response, some New Englanders dressed up as Native Americans and boarded a British boat with boxes of tea. They threw over $3 million worth of tea overboard, and the event was probably called the Boston Tea Party.
In response to that, British Parliament imposed the Intolerable or Coercive Acts of 1774. The acts closed down the Boston Harbor, banned meetings in Massachusetts, allowed soldiers to quarter in colonist houses, and made British royal officials be tried in Britain, instead of the colonies.
The First Continental Congress was a meeting of delegates from all the colonies, except Georgia. They decided to send King George III a petition begging him to change his ways. He didn't respond. The Second Continental Congress, a year afterwards, decided to send King George III the Olive Branch petition, also begging him to change his ways. In response, the king threatened them with death.
With no other options, led by John Adams, the Second Continental Congress decided to send him the Declaration of Independence. They nominated Thomas Jefferson to write it. It was a document saying the colonies were separate from Britain, with 27 grievances explaining why. It also said the colonies did not want war, but they knew that was their eventual fate.
Created using Powtoon.
Lexington and Concord were the first battles of the American Revolution. They happened 2 weeks before the start of the First Continental Congress. The Battle of Lexington was fought on April 19, 1775, and the militiamen were led by John Parker, who said, "Don't shoot until you see the white of their eyes." Nobody knows who shot first, but it was called a shot heard around the world.
After that, British troops were marching towards Concord. Paul Revere heard about this and rode his horse, warning everyone with the phrase, "The British are coming, the British are coming." This made the militiamen in Concord more aware, and they gave the British a better fight.
During the American Revolution, there were 2 groups of people. Patriots, who supported the revolution and were in favor of independence. These were mainly people from the New England colonies, and they were also mostly middle/poor class. Loyalists were people who did not support the revolution and supported staying with Britain. They were mainly from the southern colonies and were mostly upper class because they were afraid to lose their slaves.
After some early defeats in the war, the Second Continental Congress decided to combine all the militias together and create the Continental Army. John Adams nominated a wealthy landowner from Virginia, George Washington, to lead it. Washington had the difficult task of uniting a group of nobodies into being the most powerful army in the world.
The British planned to take the main cities to demotivate the colonists. The first city they aimed for was one of the biggest, Boston.
Washington was determined to take back the city, so he planned to capture Fort Ticonderoga in Ticonderoga, New York. After they captured the fort, they brought the cannons on Dorchester Heights. They positioned the cannons at such an angle so the British could not counterattack. This was one display of Washington's genius as the British evacuated Boston.
The Battle of Trenton, New Jersey was a battle that took place after the crossing of the Delaware River. It took place on December 26, 1776. Washington planned 3 different sections of the army would cross the Delaware River in different areas, but those armies took too long, as the river was frozen and the weather was terrible.
In the end, Washington's section was the only one to make it, even though it was hours after the designated time to make it across. Even after all that, they still managed to attack and capture Trenton, taking 800 to 900 prisoners, wounding 80 and killing 22. The American side only had 5 wounded, and the only ones that died were people who froze to death crossing the river. It was a crushing defeat for the British.
Now we will talk about the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga was arguably the most important battle in the American Revolution because it convinced the French to join the war on the colonial side and for the Dutch to loan money for weapons. General John Burgoyne led a march of about 7,000 British soldiers to New York. Burgoyne was going to fight with some extra recruits from British Canada, but that help never came. The British tried to fight back, but they were clearly outmatched. Soon, Burgoyne's forces were surrounded by American troops and were forced to surrender.
It was a harsh winter, the years of 1777 to 1778. Washington's army decided to stay in Valley Forge, a couple miles away from British-captured Philadelphia. Provisions were running low in everything, and disease was rampant amongst their ranks. Many of their soldiers' enlistments were over, and many soldiers were deserting. The help came in a gay Prussian military leader named Baron von Steuben. With urging from Washington, the volunteer decided to train the army. Slowly, confidence grew, and the army became much better and professional. In the end, from 12,000 soldiers, a quarter had died, and 1,000 hadn't re-enlisted, but the soldiers that stayed became stronger and much more confident.
When the French Navy came, they camped out off the coast of Rhode Island. The British found out and were planning to attack the French while they were off guard and had no clue what the British were thinking. Luckily, Washington was able to intercept this message through his intricate spy system in New York and sent out their navy to fend off the British to keep French's army navy intact.
The Battle of Yorktown was also one of the most important battles in the American Revolution. It happened September 28th to October 19th, 1781. With the added support of the French Navy and Army, the colonists outnumbered the British 18,900 to 9,000. It was a decisive victory for Franco-America.
The surrender of Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown led to the Treaty of Paris of 1763 being made, which is a document signed by representatives of King George III and the 13 colonies, declaring the 13 colonies free and independent. Also, the declaration was recognized by the British government.
Created using Powtoon.
The Articles of Confederation were the first set of governing laws of the new country. It was ratified March 1st, 1781. People did not like the Articles of Confederation because there were a lot of problems within the document itself.
The one problem was that there was a weak legislative branch. This was a problem because you needed 9 out of 13 states to enact law, and most of them couldn't agree on anything. Another problem was that there was no executive branch, so there was no one to enforce the laws. There was also no judicial branch, so that if the legislation passed a weird law, there would be no one to stop it.
Two other main problems were that there was no military to protect the people from common threats like the Indians and the British, because they still had forts in America, and the Articles of Confederation did not give the power to tax, which was a huge problem, because there was no way to pay back the loans from the Dutch and the Spanish. If they needed to fix something, they had no power to raise taxes to fix it.
One event that occurred because of the weak government system was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion happened because war veterans were angry that they were not paid for fighting in the Revolution. The government had no power to tax, so they had no power to pay back these people. Fighting broke out and eventually it settled down, but this was one display of how weak the Articles of Confederation actually were.
The Constitutional Convention took place from May 25th, 1787 to September 25th, 1787. At first, their goal was to repair the Articles of Confederation, but after a while, they decided to throw out the Articles of Confederation and write a whole new one. A delegate from Virginia named James Madison had an idea that the delegates would eventually accept. By combining many ideas from different philosophers, the idea of 3 branches of government was built: legislative branch to enact laws, executive branch to enforce laws, and judicial branch to evaluate laws. This seemed like a good system, but there were 2 main issues that needed to be solved before going forward.
The first problem was how was representation in the legislature going to be based on? The Virginia plan stated a representation in the legislature should be based on population, to give bigger states more power. The New Jersey plan stated that representation in the legislature should be equal for each state, no matter the size of population of the state. After numerous debates, Connecticut asked the question of why not doing both, and thus was the Great Compromise, or Connecticut Plan, was built. The House of Representatives is the living embodiment of the Virginia Plan because representation in the House of Representatives is based on population, and the Senate is equal for each state. giving each state 2 seats no matter which state it was, Virginia or New Jersey.
The second problem is how slavery would play a role in representation in the House of Representatives. The South wanted the slaves to be counted because they had a lot of slaves, and they knew if they had more seats in the legislature, they would get more seats and dominate to get the laws they want. The North did not want slaves to count as people because they knew they would give the South less seats, and the North would dominate to get the laws they want. After a while, they decided that slaves would count as 3/5 of the person, hence the name the 3/5 Compromise.
After the ratification of the Constitution, they decided they would need a leader of the executive branch, a president. They unanimously elected George Washington to be our first president. John Adams was the vice president.
The legislative branch is the lawmaking branch of government. A nickname for the legislation is Congress. There are 2 houses in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. House of Representatives seats are based on population, which makes 435 seats today, and the Senate is equal for each state, which is 2 seats, which makes 100 seats today. The House of Representatives is elected for 2-year terms, so their minds are thinking short term, while the Senate is elected for 6-year terms, so their minds are thinking long term. This is why the Senate is responsible for approving foreign treaties, approving the President's cabinet, and approving the Supreme Court. Some balances that the executive branch has on the legislative branch are the President can veto laws even when Congress passes them. Some balances the judicial branch has on the legislative branch are they can declare a law unconstitutional, making it not valid.
The executive branch is the branch that enforces laws. The executive branch is led by the president and vice president. The president is chosen by a system called the Electoral College. The Electoral College has 535 seats, combining the House of Representatives and Senate seats for each state. Some powers the president have is to veto laws, sign foreign treaties with other countries, and they are also the commander-in-chief of the military. While the president is the most powerful person in the federal government, he can only do what the Congress tells him what to do. Our current president is Barack Obama. Some checks and balances on the executive branch is that even if the president vetoes a bill, 2/3 of both houses can override the veto. The judicial branch can declare presidential action unconstitutional.
The judicial branch is the branch that evaluates laws. It is led by the Supreme Court and the 9 justices in it. There is 1 Chief Justice. Justices are nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. Justices serve for life. So instead of worrying about re-election and doing what's popular, they're not pressured. Instead of doing what's popular, doing what's right. Over time, as new justices come in, as they interpret the Constitution in different ways, their main job is to check whether laws are unconstitutional or constitutional, mainly dealing with the Bill of Rights. There are many courts under the Supreme Court, but you can repeal your case all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court gets thousands of cases every year. On the judicial branch is that President nominates and the Senate approves judges, and Congress has the power to impeach judges.
The Bill of Rights is a document stating an individual's rights. They are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were written by James Madison in response to several states wanting constitutional protection for individual liberties. Federalists didn't want to think a Bill of Rights was necessary, but anti-federalists thought it was necessary. Originally, the Bill of Rights wasn't in the Constitution, and it was passed, but in 1791 they added it, winning the other states who hadn't voted for the Constitution.
Created using Powtoon.